One way you could think about trying to describe my work or my process is that I have an obsession with making bootlegs, with making, like a bootleg. You got the Louis Vuitton bag, and then you have the bootleg Louis Vuitton bag, right? And they look almost similar, and they take a lot of skill to make on either side. But that's the best way I can kind of describe what my work and my process is a lot about. It's about how we see, visualize, and the kind of narratives that we get from objects, the way that they help us think about other people and aspects of society, but also the ability to make the object itself, right? To have that kind of control and be hyper aware in making the thing. So I feel like that's an easy way to describe some parts of what I do, or maybe an entrance to what it is that I do in the studio, the kind of work that I make. One thing that I do in the studio, and that I have an ongoing series of works that are these particular ceramic rims. And these rims, as you see over here, are full size. They are made to be the scale and proportions of one that would fit on an automobile, right? And so on the one hand, it's, obviously they're not usable, but it's being in a place where I can think about these objects as status symbols, and I can create the objects, I can make them. And again, they're not usable, but they end up being portraits of homages to this kind of object type and the culture around it, what gives it its kind of value and power and significance in particular social spaces, right? So something like this is something where you can see it's of a pretty large scale, right? But doing this, and making the piece and making the object, takes a lot of effort, right? It's very physically labor-intensive work. That's a tough one. It's kind of there's no easy answer for that. It's all the same stuff that has to do with my process and the kinds of objects that I'm concerned with, or I'm interested in investigating, implementing, however they show up. That's a lot of the stuff that does inspire me. So when I think about something still, considering pieces like this or this ongoing series, not only am I interested in them in terms of status and what it means as a distinct point of Black and urban culture in the greater world of car culture and status seen in car culture. Another thing about these wheels is that you don't just buy a set. You don't just buy a set of dubs and throw them on your car. You actually take the car and get the car physically modified. That means often the body is reshaped. The wheel wells are blown out. There's new axles and suspension put on the vehicle to be able to fit those particular wheels, right? And as it goes too, the car doesn't turn very well either because they're so large, right? So in some ways they start to become kind of like a white elephant, so to speak, right? Their inconveniences far outweighs their value for you as status. But in putting them on the cars, there's a great amount of skill that goes into that. That's a separate world of craft and making and engaging in the built environment that I'm ultimately concerned with. So that would be a place, right? Kind of keep it to the kind of work that I'm making, and also talking about my value for skill where I find inspiration. So not just thinking about modified automobiles, but I also see this in badly built homes. And so maybe that's kind of humorous, but I'm interested in people's solutions to fixing something. I'm interested in people's reasons to display something. see it in two ways. I see it as artists represent their communities as they engage in the practice of contemporary art, whoever they may be. So as we see more artists that have historically been marginalized participating, this is part of that representation. So it's about your community now having a position and a voice and a stance within a discourse that may have been exclusive, excluding your community until this point. But there's also another side to that I think is maybe more important than what does representation look like in the greater institution discourse of contemporary art? And that is the value of being a community member and having work that is both being represented now in the institution of contemporary art, but is also very specific to you and your community and cultural experience, to your identity experience. And so I think that's really important as well. And so that means that it's not just about having better representation in museums, but it's actually the discourse being open to new vernacular. And not in a subversive detorment kind of way, right? Like not just appropriating it for its own uses and bringing it back into its own mainstream institution, but respecting it and giving it that intellectual and cultural space. I would like, if my work was looked at in 100 years from now, for people, or whoever it is, maybe not people, to be reading the things that I have made for their significance, for how they fall into a continued dialogue of object types in the way that we identify them, that something like a rim itself is indicative of the kind of value or the kind of meaning or exteriority that they represent, right? So it falls into that kind of thinking and kind of affirms it, right? Because it's a portrait, it's an homage to it. But also in the way that how things are made, and particularly in the way that so many of the things that I make are commenting on different object types and the kinds of narratives we ascribe to them, but also that they're very specific, that they are essentially all one-offs, that everything, even if it was a ready-made that was altered, is still a very distinct, specific kind of thing. They are outliers in terms of the general production and consumption. So I would hope that there would be critical thinking 100 years from now that would lead us to that. Completely up in the air on that one.